everybody, it's Matt. Thanks for hanging out with me on my YouTube channel. I just made a super simple map here of the world of the Bible. New Testament, Old Testament. This little projection I made covers pretty much everywhere that the action takes place. But here's the problem with this map as I look at it. I don't feel this map. When I read the Bible, I don't feel these distances. I don't intuit the relationship between geography and travel time the way I do when I think about my own country, the United States. I got a great sense of the United States. I feel how far it is to Chicago. I feel how far it is to Florida or New York City or Los Angeles or Denver. All of those things are built into this mental map, this intuition that I have of my own geography. Well, I wanted to get closer to feeling that with the Bible stuff so I could understand more how the original audience, how the characters in the story related to their space. So what I did is I made a very specific projection here, and then I just dropped it to scale right over the top of my home country, the United States of America. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room here because all of the big cities and places in the Holy Land fit over the top of the continental US. So I bumped it around just a little bit, did a bunch of measurements to make sure it would all work out. I ran several different versions of this with cities in slightly different places, but I like this one the best. And I thought it would be fun to do a little tour together of this overlay map and see if maybe it's useful for both of us in terms of getting oriented to the Bible story. So let's start where all the action starts, and that is in Jerusalem. And the way I ultimately lined things up here, Jerusalem sits a little bit east of Wichita, Kansas, with the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee running up the east side of Kansas. You'll see Tyre sits right there, probably a little bit east of Manhattan, Kansas. And then Damascus, look at that, that sits right over the top of Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri. So that gives us a sense of the heartland of the story. And then from there, let's go south and west out toward Egypt. The Sinai Peninsula sits right over the top of central Oklahoma, probably a lot of tornadoes there. Alexandria, which isn't a city for most of the Old Testament, but in between the Testaments, Alexander the Great founded that. Looks like that sits around Fort Dodge, Kansas, again, maybe a little bit east of there. And then Memphis, not Memphis, Tennessee, this is Memphis, Egypt, is sitting a little east of Amarillo, Texas. I don't know what's exactly in that part of Texas. Thebes is sitting near Abilene, Texas, sort of around Austin or San Antonio. And then if we go west a little bit more, the region of Cyrene is sitting around Moab, Utah. And then if we go west even further out toward Tunisia and Carthage, home of the age-old enemy of the Romans, we see that that's sitting in Northern California, southern coastal Oregon. We see that Corsica and Sardinia are sitting in the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver Island, Seattle, Olympia, Portland area. Sicily and Malta are in the Idaho, Oregon desert there. And then Rome would be, no, I've made a mistake here. I've got Rome where Naples ought to be. Rome should be further up the boot, north and west. It would be a little bit north of Yakima, Washington. As we go east from Rome, we get into mainland Greece here. The Peloponnesian Peninsula sits down around Lander, Wyoming, Jackson, Wyoming, the Grand Tetons, Yellowstone National Park. Athens sits over close to the east entrance of the park near Cody, Wyoming. And then Thessalonica, this is one of the places where this exercise is really helpful for me because I think of Greece as being this teeny tiny little thing and all these towns being so close by, but Thessalonica is like way up there in Billings, Montana, central Montana, north of that even. That's a long way from Athens. Crete, the home of Minoan civilization on this projection, would sit around Cheyenne, Wyoming, Laramie, Wyoming, in that brutal I-80 corridor. And then Ephesus sits over near Gillette, Wyoming. There's a lot of Wyoming. It's the least populated state in the country, and yet so much land's there. Whatever. The Black Hills of South Dakota are here in Asia Minor with Sardis sitting around Spearfish, South Dakota, Devil's Tower, Deadwood, that kind of area. Byzantium, which isn't really a Bible city, but it factors very heavily in early church history. That sits around Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The bulk of Asia Minor in this projection sits right over the top of South Dakota, reaching down to the sandhills of northern Nebraska. Cyprus just sits right along I-80 in those mid-sized Nebraska cities like Kearney, Grand Island, York, and then on into Lincoln and almost Omaha. So really, I mean, for me at least, if you've never driven across Nebraska, maybe it doesn't make as much sense. But for me, that's very orienting as to the size of Cyprus. It's Kearney to Omaha. Oh, well, I've driven that a whole bunch of times. I can imagine that now. Tarsus, where the Apostle Paul is from, sits right over the top of Sioux City, Iowa. Antioch, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians, is real close to Des Moines, Iowa. Well, a little bit west of Des Moines, but you get the idea. Carchemish, which might be the only city on here that isn't immediately familiar to Bible readers. That's the site of the battle where the Assyrian Empire in 605 BC finally started to come unraveled at the hands of the upstart Babylonians. That sits around maybe Mason City, Iowa, on what is that, I-35 going up north toward Minneapolis. I might not be getting that right, but something like that. It looks like the Euphrates is snaking down here from Northwoods territory through Wisconsin and Iowa. I can always remember Euphrates on the left, Tigris on the right, because E.T., like the extraterrestrials, and Euphrates, Tigris. They both end up down in the Persian Gulf, which covers most of South Carolina. And Nineveh sits on the banks of the Tigris right over the top of where Chicago would be. So that was kind of interesting, the way that lined up. And then as we move over here to the ancient capital of the Medes, that being Ecbatana, we're kind of between Columbus and Cleveland, Ohio, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then we drop down south here to Susa, which is one of the capitals of the Persians. This is where most of the story of Esther takes place, and that's in western West Virginia. I don't know any of the cities or towns around that area. Maybe you can fill me in. Moving west from there, we see that Babylon sits right over the top of Louisville, Kentucky, so it's a pretty easy one to keep track of. And then Ur sits a little south of there around Great Smoky Mountain National Park territory, Pigeon Forge, Knoxville. And then way out east, you get a couple of the other capitals of Persia. They had a lot of capitals. Pasargadae and Persepolis are on the coast there of North Carolina. I think there's value in just this little map tour that we did. I'm going to remember things from this conversation we just had forever when I'm looking at this part of the world, when I'm reading the Bible. But I also think that this is going to help me think more clearly about the characters and their motivations when I look at stories in the Bible that involve travel over long distances. I mean, think about Mary and Joseph and little baby Jesus, and Joseph has a dream that says, you got to get out of here. A dream. How compelling would a dream have to be to get you to get up in the morning, leave your job, take that kid, that wife who just had a baby, and hoof it from around the suburbs of Kansas City all the way to northern Texas? You'd have to be absolutely sure that that was real, that that was from God. Think about Paul of Tarsus. This guy has a vision on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians. And you might be like, well, I mean, lots of people say they have visions or whatever. I mean, it's a lot more compelling if you do something with the vision, if the vision costs you something. Well, it cost Paul something, and you appreciate what it cost him so much more when you look at this map. I mean, Lewis and Clark left from Missouri as well, St. Louis in this case, and they covered basically the same amount of territory in their one journey that Paul then went on to cover 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 times, depending on what happened after the Bible. Paul made the Lewis and Clark journey across all of the equivalent of the American West again and again and again. You think he thought that that encounter with the risen Christ on the road was real? Well, just looking at this map helps me appreciate how much more he was certain of the reality of that thing. Looking at this map helps me appreciate what it would be like to march an entire crew of exiles off to captivity in Babylon. Again, you're going from a little bit outside the suburbs of Kansas City over to Louisville, Kentucky. You're walking this crowd of people, hundreds of thousands, millions overland, maybe with their stuff, maybe in shackles. And I mean, really, it corresponds pretty closely to another famous forced march from history that kind of goes the other way geographically, but that being the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee were forcibly relocated out of their homeland in Georgia. How about Nehemiah, cupbearer to King Artaxerxes in the book of Nehemiah? I think that story happened in Susa. I'm not sure on that. It happened in one of the capitals of Persia. But Nehemiah hears a story that his people's hometown in Jerusalem doesn't have walls and is vulnerable, and he looks sad. And the king's like, what's the problem? And he's like, well, we don't have walls in our town. And, you know, a town's not a town if it doesn't have walls. And the king gives him leave to go and oversee it being rebuilt. And Nehemiah leaves literally the cushiest dining room table in all of planet Earth at that time to hoof it from West Virginia to the outskirts of the suburbs of Kansas City, not once, but twice. You think he meant it? Well, I appreciate how much he meant it, all the more when I can see it over the top of the map of a place that I know really well. Now, look, I have to note, this is obviously a very American-centric exercise that we're doing here. And I know that for people maybe from Europe, this doesn't make as much sense, but you understand the exercise. I'm trying to put it over the top of a place I know. Maybe we could do a couple more of these videos where we go and drop it over the top of Europe or other parts of the world to see how it plays out there. I'd also like to do another video where we pinch zoom in on Jerusalem and lay that little tiny but very significant sliver of land over the top of a bunch of parts of the world to get a sense of this very zoomed in little part of the biblical map where so much of the story of the Old and New Testament occurs. So I'll probably do a little bit more of this moving forward is the point. This channel exists because a handful of you have gone over to patreon.com/TMBH and you're like, I want weird Bible, church, internet, and this channel is weird, so I'm going to support it for whatever reason. Thank you. I super appreciate it. This wouldn't exist without you. I'm going to make a bunch of different versions of this map in high resolution available to everybody who supports the program at patreon.com/TMBH. Even if you only support for like $1, it's still going to be available to you. So if you're a patron already, that'll be up when this video is published. If you'd like to become a patron, it'll be there for you as well. If not, no worries. That's cool as well. All right. I think that's everything. More stuff like this to come. I'm Matt. Thanks for hanging out with me on my YouTube channel, and let's do this again soon.